A career can start closing long before it starts feeling bad. The person is still employed, still functioning, still receiving reasonable feedback, still moving through familiar routines without open crisis. Nothing dramatic announces that something has gone wrong. But the role stops expanding, exposure stops widening, new difficulty stops appearing, and the future begins repeating the present more than extending it. Most people interpret career stagnation only when frustration becomes obvious. In reality, stagnation usually starts earlier at the structural level, while life still feels normal enough to continue. This is the pattern this video is diagnosing. Not burnout in the narrow sense, not sudden failure, not a collapse in ambition. A quieter structural process. Career growth often stalls before the person has the emotional evidence to name it. By the time the feeling of being stuck becomes clear, the underlying slowdown has usually been in place for much longer. The usual explanation is delayed and psychological. People assume they are only stuck once they become visibly unhappy, underpaid, resentful, or openly blocked. As long as work is tolerable, income is stable, and nothing feels urgent enough to force a decision, the career is assumed to be broadly fine. Discomfort becomes the signal people wait for. But dissatisfaction is often late. Career stagnation does not begin when the person finally says, "I'm stuck." It begins when the structure stops producing movement while still producing enough order to prevent alarm. Consider Adrian. He works in a respectable mid-level role at a large company. His job is not miserable. He knows the systems, understands the expectations, and has enough credibility to move through the week without constant scrutiny. He is competent, trusted, and busy enough to feel useful. He gets decent reviews. His manager likes him. His compensation is not exceptional, but it is stable enough to make life manageable. If someone asks how work is going, Adrian gives a familiar answer. Fine. And for a while, that answer appears accurate. He is not being pushed out. He is not being humiliated. He is not visibly failing. But something has quietly changed. 2 years ago, the role still felt developmental. He was learning, stretching, making mistakes at a useful scale, seeing new parts of the business, getting access to more complex work. Now the weeks are smoother. He can predict most problems before they happen. The same kinds of meetings repeat. The same level of responsibility recurs. The same people continue making the larger decisions. He is still busy, but less changed by the work. This is where stagnation begins, not when the person starts hating the job, when the role stops altering the person's position. That distinction matters because many careers continue functioning after they stop developing. The person can remain professionally active while structurally static. Work still consumes time, still generates income, still provides identity, still creates the appearance of forward motion. But the underlying variables that once created growth begin flattening: responsibility depth, skill expansion, visibility, leverage, access, strategic scope, decision proximity. At first, this is easy to miss. Stable work disguises slow closure. Adrian does not wake up one day and think, "My career has entered a stagnation phase." He notices smaller things, fewer first-time challenges, fewer conversations that change anything, fewer opportunities that expand his profile. He becomes more efficient, but not more mobile. He is working, but less is opening. That does not yet feel alarming because the emotional surface remains manageable. He can still tell himself he is doing fine because nothing is broken enough to contradict him. That is why career growth stalls so quietly. The structure changes before the interpretation does. The false premise says that a person is only stuck once the situation feels obviously bad. But emotional recognition lags structural reality. A career can already be narrowing while the person still feels stable, grateful, responsible, even mildly comfortable. Stagnation does not require visible suffering to begin. It only requires that movement slow down while continuity remains intact. This is the mechanism. Early in many careers, motion is easier to detect because change is frequent. New role, new learning, new exposure, new systems, new mistakes, new status signals. The person can feel progress because the surrounding environment keeps forcing adaptation. Later, the signs get harder to read. Competence increases. Daily friction decreases. The person becomes more locally effective. And that local effectiveness creates an illusion of ongoing growth because smoothness feels like maturity. But smoothness can mean two different things. It can mean the person has developed, or it can mean the role is no longer stretching them in a way that changes future possibility. Those are not the same outcome. Adrian is now good enough at his current layer that the job rarely demands expansion. He can handle most of what reaches him. He knows how to speak in the company's language. He understands the personalities, the politics, the workflow, the expected level of polish. That competence makes him valuable, but it also makes the present easier to repeat. The role stops acting like a platform and starts acting like a stable container. This is where career stagnation often hides, inside successful repetition. Nothing dramatic has to go wrong. A person can be appreciated and stagnating. A person can be well-reviewed and stagnating. A person can be paid regularly and stagnating. A person can look responsible, accomplished, and stable while their mobility is already weakening. That is why the emotional realization comes late. Most people do not monitor career movement directly. They monitor pain. They notice when they feel bored enough, angry enough, excluded enough, underpaid enough, or exhausted enough. But by the time those feelings become unmistakable, the structural slowdown has often been underway for months or years. Adrian eventually starts sensing it in indirect ways. He watches other people move into adjacent roles while his own work becomes more familiar. He notices that senior people trust him to execute, but not necessarily to define direction. He sees that his week is full, yet little in it seems to change his future position. The discomfort begins not as crisis, but as repetition, acquiring a slightly closed feeling. That is the emotional surface catching up. What his situation proves is not that every stable period at work is stagnation. It proves that career stagnation begins before the person has enough dissatisfaction to name it clearly. The early sign is structural flattening, not emotional collapse. This also explains why so many people search "why I'm stuck in my career" only after the pattern has deepened. They wait until the experience becomes undeniable. By then, the stagnation feels sudden because the recognition is sudden. But the actual process was gradual. Role movement slowed, challenge narrowed, exposure stopped widening. The person remained inside continuity long enough that the slowdown became normal before it became alarming. That is why How to Get Unstuck in Your Career often starts from the wrong timestamp. It treats stagnation as a condition that begins at the moment of distress. In reality, distress is usually late-stage evidence. The career begins stalling earlier, in quieter places, when responsibilities become repetitive rather than expanding. When performance remains good, but scope remains fixed. When the person gets better at the role without getting closer to anything larger. When visibility stays local. When trust increases only within the current lane. When competence deepens, but position does not. These are structural signals, not emotional ones. And because they are structural, they are easy to misread as success. That is the trap. People are taught to interpret stability as proof of progress. If nothing is wrong, then something must still be right. If the job is decent, the team is functional, the manager is supportive enough, and pay keeps arriving, then career concerns can seem exaggerated. The person feels unreasonable for questioning a life that works on paper. But careers do not stall only in openly bad environments. They often stall in tolerable ones. In fact, tolerable environments are especially effective at delaying recognition because they produce enough comfort to suppress urgency. A miserable job forces interpretation. A manageable job often prevents it. Adrian's role is not painful enough to provoke decisive reevaluation. That makes it easier for stagnation to remain invisible while it deepens. The company may even reinforce the illusion. He is described as dependable, solid, trusted, important to the team. These signals feel positive, and they are positive in a narrow sense. But they do not automatically mean movement is happening. A person can become increasingly useful to the present without becoming increasingly connected to the future. That is one of the clearest signs of stagnation. The role keeps extracting value. The structure stops expanding possibility. This is also why career stagnation is often misdiagnosed as a motivation problem. The person starts feeling flat and assumes the issue is psychological. Maybe they lost ambition. Maybe they became complacent. Maybe they are not as driven as they used to be. Sometimes that interpretation is emotionally convenient because it keeps the problem inside the self. But often the flatter feeling is not the cause of stagnation. It is the delayed effect of structural repetition. The person is not unmotivated first and stagnant second. They are stagnant first, then slowly demotivated by the experience of functioning inside a role that no longer changes what is available to them. That sequence matters. It means emotional decline is often downstream from role design, not evidence of personal deterioration. To make this clearer, imagine a different system. Take another employee with Adrian's same intelligence, seriousness, and work ethic, but in a structure where role movement remains active. Expectations evolve. Scope widens over time. Exposure increases. New constraints appear. Skills stay transferable. Senior access expands. The person can still feel tired or pressured, but the work continues altering their future position. In that system, temporary comfort does not automatically become stagnation because the structure still produces movement underneath the routine. Now compare that with Adrian's situation. He is not failing. He is not even obviously blocked. But the role has become internally complete. It can continue indefinitely without materially changing his trajectory. The structure is no longer developmental enough to move him, even though it is stable enough to keep him. The same competence, different structural result. That contrast matters because it resets the interpretation of the problem. Career stagnation is not best identified by how unhappy a person feels. It is better identified by whether the current role is still altering access, scope, leverage, and future position. Emotional dissatisfaction is relevant, but it is not the earliest sign. The reframe is this: a career starts getting stuck when motion declines before discomfort becomes visible enough to interrupt it. That is why people are often surprised by their own stagnation. They assumed they would feel it early and clearly. They assumed being stuck would announce itself through obvious misery, conflict, or failure. But most stagnation begins in a much quieter form. The person remains productive. The environment remains manageable. The role remains respectable. The weeks keep passing. Only later does the emotional interpretation arrive and give the slowdown a name. By then, the person often says, "I don't know when this happened." Usually it happened gradually, through normalized repetition. Less novelty, less widening, less movement, more competence in the same range, more ease without more expansion, more continuity than development. That is not dramatic enough to trigger alarm, but it is often enough to begin closing a career from the inside. The relevant variable is position, not mood, not motivation alone, not whether the person can still tolerate the week. The deeper question is whether the current role is still changing their position in a meaningful way. If it is not, then stagnation may already be in progress, even before the person has enough emotional evidence to admit it. And this pattern does not stop with careers. The same logic appears in money, relationships, creativity, and identity. Systems often stop moving long before they start feeling intolerable. The emotional realization comes later because tolerance can continue after structural expansion has ended. A person is often stuck long before they feel stuck enough to say it.